She thought she was just buying scrap metal on wings. When Ellie Monroe traded her life savings for a rusted-out cargo plane rotting in a field, everyone said she'd lost her mind. But tucked inside the fuselage, buried beneath dust and silence, she found something no one expected, something lost, hidden, and worth far more than money. What started as a risky impulse became the discovery of a lifetime. Before we dive in, tell us where in the world you're watching from. And if stories like this stir something in you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. The first time Ellie Monroe saw the plane, it was more shadow than machine. Resting in the back corner of a forgotten airfield, the cargo aircraft sat tilted slightly on its broken landing gear, rust bleeding down its once silver fuselage like tears that had never been wiped away. Tall grass grew up past the belly, hiding the wheels like the earth was trying to reclaim it. The sun had long since scorched off the registration numbers, and birds had built nests in the creases of its wings. Most people would have looked right through it, another piece of scrap fading into history. But Ellie stopped walking. She put her hand on the chipped metal skin and whispered, "You've got a story, don't you?" She didn't tell anyone about it at first. Not her brothers, who thought she worked too hard already. Not her old boss, who used to say she had too much grease under her nails to be taken seriously. And definitely not her landlord, who had been circling her overdue rent like a vulture. But something about that plane hooked into her gut and wouldn't let go. Every night after closing up the garage, she'd drive out to that overgrown patch of runway and sit in the dirt beside it, watching the moonlight crawl across its dented hull like it was trying to remember what it once was. Ellie had never flown anything in her life, but she knew machines, knew what it meant to rescue something that others had given up on. Her whole life had been about second chances. Hers just never looked as glamorous as other people's. Her dad taught her how to rebuild a carburetor before she learned to parallel park. When he passed, she took over the garage. Clients came less and less each year. By the time the bank threatened to pull the plug, she was surviving on small-town loyalty and a rusted-out soda machine that only took quarters. The plane wasn't part of any plan. It wasn't practical. But it felt right in the way that gut feelings do when the world gets quiet enough to hear them. So she tracked down the owner of the airfield, a chain-smoking, sunburned man named Walt, and made an offer. He looked at her like she'd offered to buy a ghost. "That thing?" he said, spitting into the dirt. "Ain't flown since before I stopped drinking." She smiled. "That's fine. I'm not looking to fly it. I just want to bring it back to life." He shrugged. "It's yours if you can move it." "Hell, I'll take $2,000 and call it done." She drained her last savings to cover it. Cash. No paperwork, no receipt, just a handshake, a crooked grin, and the keys to a lockbox full of old maintenance logs. Ellie didn't care. She didn't know what she was chasing exactly. All she knew was that when she stepped up into the fuselage for the first time, the air stale and thick with dust, the silence pressing in around her like a held breath, it felt like walking into a cathedral. And somehow, she knew. Something important had been left behind. When Ellie told people she'd bought a plane, most assumed she meant a ticket. When they realized she meant a literal, physical aircraft, one that hadn't seen sky in decades, they looked at her like she'd lost something more than just money. "You bought what?" her older brother Shane had asked, blinking like she was speaking another language. "A C-119, she replied calmly, rinsing the grease off her hands. "Boxcar transport plane, Korean War era, maybe earlier." He laughed, but not the funny kind. "You need help, Elle." Maybe she did, but not the kind he meant. She moved the plane 2 weeks later. It took a flatbed hauler, a small crane, and every favor she was owed in 3 counties. The cargo bay doors barely held together during the trip, flapping like wounded wings as the convoy inched across rural Georgia roads. Kids lined up on their porches to see what was coming. Even a few old-timers saluted it from lawn chairs. By dusk, it sat behind her shop crooked, sun-bleached, and still too massive for the narrow gravel lot. Ellie didn't sleep that night. She just stood beside it, staring at the dull aluminum shell, thinking of the stories it must have swallowed. She knew the numbers didn't make sense. Her garage barely stayed afloat with oil changes and the occasional custom rebuild. Spending her last dime on a dead aircraft wasn't a business decision, it was something else. She couldn't explain it, not even to herself. The truth was, she hadn't felt this alive since her father passed. He used to say, "Machines don't talk, but they remember. You just have to learn their language." Maybe the plane remembered something. Maybe she could learn to listen. Inside, it smelled like rust, oil, and time. Ellie worked alone at first, hauling out soggy crates and disintegrating seat cushions. A family of raccoons had nested in the tail section. She chased them out with a flashlight and a broom. The floor was layered with decades of grime, but under it all, the bones were solid. The cockpit was frozen and time gauges clouded, yoke stiff, overhead switches fused in mid-flip, like someone had been mid-flight when the world stopped. She touched everything gently, like she was brushing dust off a tomb. She didn't tell anyone about the money, about how much she really paid, or that the rent was overdue, or that she hadn't been to the doctor in a year because she couldn't afford the deductible. She didn't say that fixing this plane was the only thing that made her heart feel full in a long, long time. Because when you're a woman in coveralls, standing knee-deep in broken dreams, people don't ask what you feel. They ask what you owe. But Ellie wasn't doing this to be understood. She was doing it because when she closed her eyes at night, she saw herself flying. Not in the sky, but toward something. Something buried, something forgotten, something that hadn't been touched in years. She didn't know it yet, but in a matter of days, her gamble would uncover more than rust and rivets. It would uncover history. By the third week, Ellie had stripped most of the loose debris out of the fuselage. The cargo bay was nearly empty now, revealing the skeletal framework of the plane's interior, exposed ribs like the inside of a whale. Everything echoing with every footstep. The metal groaned at night, expanding and contracting with the temperature swings. Sometimes it sounded almost like breathing. She told herself it was just physics, but she still found herself whispering, "Sorry," when she dropped a tool too loudly. She worked at night mostly. The garage still needed to run during the day, and she couldn't afford to lose her regulars. But after closing, she'd grab a thermos of gas station coffee, pull on her hoodie, and disappear into the body of the aircraft like it was a second skin. It wasn't just about cleaning. She was studying it, learning its rhythm, tracing wires, sketching panel layouts, comparing them to old technical manuals she found on military surplus forums. Something didn't add up. For one, the rear cargo bay was far smaller than it should have been. The floor sloped too quickly, the ceiling dipped too early, and there were rivet patterns that didn't match the schematics. At first, she thought it was a mod, maybe for medical transport or classified use. But it wasn't just different, it was hidden. She found a welded seam under the right-hand wall panel that wasn't supposed to be there. It was jagged, like it had been done in haste, then covered with spray paint and aluminum sheeting. Ellie stared at that wall for a long time, her breath visible in the cold. She set her coffee down, grabbed a chisel, and tapped. The metal rang dull and heavy, solid, but only in one spot. The rest echoed hollow. She pulled out her crowbar and wedged it against the seam. Nothing. The steel groaned under pressure but held. So she grabbed a small angle grinder, set her goggles, and sparked it alive. The grinding wheel screeched, sending a waterfall of sparks across the floor. Smoke filled the bay as she cut along the seam, careful not to go too deep. It took nearly 2 hours, 3 disc changes, and 1 sliced knuckle before the panel finally gave way with a hollow clang. Behind it, darkness. A sealed cavity, maybe 3 feet wide, maybe 4 feet deep, lined with aging insulation. Ellie turned on her flashlight and aimed it inside. At first, there was just dust. Lots of it. Rat droppings. A broken strap. Then something metallic. A box. Not bolted, just wedged in tight, like someone had stuffed it there in a hurry. She reached in, hands trembling, and pulled it free. It was a steel lockbox, about the size of a toolbox, heavy and cold. No markings, no label, just a keyhole, and the weight of secrecy. Ellie held it in both hands and whispered, "What the hell were you carrying?" She didn't open it. Not yet. Some part of her knew this wasn't just another forgotten crate. This was a secret. A question. And once opened, there would be no going back. She set it on her workbench, wiped the dust off with her sleeve, and stared at it like it might blink. Whatever this plane had been, it hadn't been just cargo. The lockbox sat on her bench like it was daring her to open it. Ellie stared at it for hours. It wasn't the size that got to her, it was the weight. Not just the physical heft, but the feel of it. Like it was holding something that had waited a long time to be seen again. She ran her fingers over the brushed metal, traced the faint scratches across the lid, and tried to guess its age. It didn't look military-issued, but it didn't look personal either. It was built for something important, and it hadn't seen light in decades. She didn't want to force it open. Not yet. Something about the moment felt like it needed witnesses, or maybe just someone who could tell her she wasn't crazy for thinking this was more than it looked. So she made a call to the only person she knew who wouldn't laugh her off the phone. Mick Torley had been a mechanic in the Air Force back in the 80s, before retiring and opening a bait shop that never quite sold bait. He still smelled like jet fuel and chewing tobacco, and he still kept flight manuals under his coffee table, just in case. Ellie had once rebuilt a Cessna carburetor with him when she was 19. They hadn't spoken in years. He showed up the next morning in a truck that looked worse than the plane. "You're lucky I was bored," he grumbled as he stepped into the hangar. Then he saw the aircraft. His voice caught. "Jesus, you pulled this thing out of the grave." Ellie pointed to the fuselage. "You ever seen a layout like that?" He climbed inside, muttering to himself, tracing lines, tapping panels, taking mental inventory. No markings, no tail code, not commercial, not civilian. This bulkhead's wrong, should be flush. And this brace, this is field welded, not factory. He stepped back, narrowed his eyes. This plane wasn't just modified, it was erased. That's when she showed him the lockbox. Mick didn't touch it right away. He just looked at it like it might explode. "Where'd you find this?" "In a sealed panel. Welded into the wall like it was never supposed to be found." He nodded slowly, chewing on the inside of his cheek. Then he stepped outside, lit a cigarette, and stared at the sky. "There were rumors," he said finally. "Back in '89, after Panama. Planes went missing. Whole birds. Not shot down, vanished. Some said they were off-grid runs, test flights, ghost cargo, black book stuff." He looked at her. "You might be holding the tail end of something that was never meant to land." Ellie felt a chill crawl up her spine. "So what do I do?" "Depends," Mick said, flicking ash to the floor. "You want to fix up an old plane? Or you want to know the truth?" She looked at the lockbox again. It was still just metal. Still just a keyhole. But now, it felt like a door to something bigger. Not just a secret, but a story buried deep enough that someone had welded it into silence. And stories like that don't stay buried forever. That night, Ellie couldn't sleep. The lockbox remained unopened, sitting like a silent weight on her workbench, but her mind was spinning. She kept thinking about Mick's face when he saw it. Not afraid exactly, but cautious, like someone who'd stumbled too close to something once and barely made it back. She figured he wouldn't return, not after muttering, "Be careful who you tell," before he climbed back into his truck. But he'd done enough. He'd confirmed what her instincts had been screaming since the first time she stepped inside that plane. This wasn't just surplus. The next morning, Ellie went back into the cockpit, hoping for answers. The pilot's seat creaked like old bones when she climbed in. Most of the instruments were long dead gauges, fogged, knobs rusted. But the flight deck still had its logbooks tucked in a canvas pouch behind the seat. She'd looked them over before, casually, not expecting much. But now, with fresh eyes, she noticed something odd. One of the logs was missing half its pages. Torn out, not fallen. The ones left behind had codes, unfamiliar airport codes that didn't appear on any civilian maps. No airline name, no unit designation, no signatures, just dates, coordinates, and cargo notes that were vague at best. Crate 7A. Priority parcel. Classified. Live support kit, no scan. The handwriting was sharp, deliberate, almost clinical. Whoever wrote this didn't expect anyone to read it later. Then she found a folded sheet stuck behind the pouch lining. Yellowed and brittle, it looked like it hadn't been touched in years. She opened it carefully. A cargo manifest. The header read Project Goliath. Below it, a short list. Crate 7A sealed container. Non-perishable. Unit 7R. Research samples. Mineral composite. File. Case. 3X. Experimental documents. Auxiliary support kits X4. Clearance code. Alpha. Tier 1. Destination. Redacted. Pilot. R. Green. Date. July 3rd, 1986. Ellie read it 3 times. Then she pulled out her phone and searched for Project Goliath. Nothing. Not one real match. Just biblical references and military speculation threads from conspiracy forums. She leaned back in the seat and exhaled, the paper still trembling in her hand. What kind of mineral composite was classified? And what kind of file case needed Alpha Tier 1 clearance? Then a terrible thought landed in her chest like a weight. What if the lockbox is file case 3X? She climbed out of the cockpit and paced the hangar floor. The manifest had coordinates, but they weren't labeled, just strings of numbers. She typed them into a map app, heart pounding. The pin dropped into the middle of an unmarked section of the Nevada desert. No roads, no buildings, just sand. A ghost destination. Ellie stared at it, goosebumps rising along her arms. She didn't know what she had stumbled into. Not really. But it was older than her, buried deeper than paperwork. She thought she'd bought a plane, an old relic to fix up, something with bones and bolts and bad wiring. But she was starting to realize she hadn't just inherited metal. She'd inherited a mystery. It was almost midnight when Ellie finally opened the lockbox. She'd spent the whole day circling it, checking the manifest again, searching government archives, digging through defunct military aircraft logs. But the truth was, nothing could have prepared her for what was inside. Not the research, not the hunches, not even Mick's cryptic warnings. Eventually, she just walked into the hangar, turned on a single overhead light, and set the box in front of her like it was a ritual. She didn't have the key, but her grinder made short work of the hinge bolts. The metal protested with a sound that split the silence, echoing like a scream against the plane's hollow ribs. She peeled back the lid slowly, heart beating in her ears. For a long second, all she saw was foam padding gray and intact, like the box had been sealed in amber. Then she reached in and pulled out the contents, one by one, her hands shaking. The first was a thick file folder, stamped with the Department of Defense emblem but old, outdated. Inside, technical schematics, dozens of them. Some labeled Prototype Module, others marked Restricted GeoX System. Ellie didn't understand half of it, but she knew enough to recognize the language of experimental engineering. She flipped through hand-drawn sketches of devices she'd never seen before, with notations and margins from 2 or 3 different Penn's arguments playing out across time. The second item was smaller, but heavier. A clear resin block, with flecks of silver-blue crystal suspended inside. It caught the light strangely, refracting it like liquid metal. There was a tag on it. Sample 19. Composite alloy. Unknown origin. Handle with gloves. She didn't. She just held it gently, stunned. This wasn't junk. This was valuable, exotic, scientific, hidden. And then came the last item, a smaller box inside the big one, wrapped in wax paper and sealed with masking tape. She peeled it open and found what looked like personal correspondence, a bundle of letters, tied with faded blue string, each one handwritten, signed by the same person, Captain R. Green, the same name from the manifest, the pilot. The first letter began plainly. To whoever finds this, I didn't sign up to disappear, but if you're reading this, then something went wrong, and you found the plane they swore didn't exist. Ellie stopped reading. Her hands trembled as she lowered the letter. The weight of what she'd opened, what she was holding, started to settle in her bones. She had something no one was supposed to find. Not just technology, not just metal. A piece of history that had been buried, hidden, erased. She looked back at the plane, at the empty cargo bay, at the patch where the wall had been cut open, at the bullet holes near the tail she hadn't noticed until now, and suddenly, the silence in the hangar didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt like a warning. Ellie knew she couldn't put any of this back. Not emotionally, not literally. The lockbox was open, and the past had spilled out. She didn't know who might come looking. She didn't know what the crystal sample was really for. But she knew one thing, with perfect, gut-level clarity. This wasn't just a forgotten plane anymore. It was a detonator. And she had just struck the match. The knock came just after dawn. Ellie was still in her garage, slumped over the workbench, where the lockbox now sat empty, its contents spread out like the pieces of a puzzle no one should solve. She hadn't slept. Not really. Every creak in the floorboards, every gust of wind outside the hangar felt like a countdown. So when the knock came 3 sharp raps on the front door of the shop, she didn't jump. She just stood slowly, wiped the grease from her palms, and walked to the door like she already knew. 2 men waited on the other side. Not cops, not reporters, just wrong. Matching windbreakers, too clean for a rural town. Shoes, with soles, too quiet. One had mirrored sunglasses he didn't take off. The other smiled with the kind of teeth you only see in courtrooms and campaign posters. "Miss Monroe?" the smiling one asked, flipping a small leather wallet open to reveal an ID that looked vaguely federal but not quite. "Depends," Ellie said flatly. "Who's asking?" "We're with the Special Division, Office of Historic Aviation Oversight." He didn't wait for her to react. "We understand you recently acquired a surplus aircraft. A C-119 transport, serial number partially defaced. Came from a private field north of Jasper?" She didn't answer. Just stared. "We'd like to examine the aircraft." "Routine check," the other one added. No smile. "Sometimes these birds have hazardous material. Old hydraulics. Even radiation depending on where they've been. Just looking out for your safety." Ellie stepped outside and closed the door behind her. "Funny. I don't recall asking for government help." Sunglasses guy shifted slightly. "You haven't. Yet." The smiling man held up a folded sheet of paper, grainy black and white photocopies of her plane, taken from a distance. "This aircraft was part of a classified program during the late Cold War period. It's not something we take lightly when it resurfaces." She took the paper. "So, you're confirming it was part of a black op?" He didn't blink. "We're confirming it shouldn't be in civilian hands." Ellie's jaw tightened. "Well, it island." A pause hung heavy between them. Then the sunglasses man said, "We'd like to know if you found anything inside. Boxes, materials, logs, artifacts." And there it was. Not even pretending anymore. Ellie shook her head slowly. "Just dust and raccoons." The men exchanged a glance. "We'll be in touch," the smiling one said finally. "This isn't going away." They left without another word. Ellie stood in the parking lot, long after their SUV disappeared down the road. The paper in her hand trembled. She turned it over and found a note scribbled on the back in pencil, faint and sharp. "They're watching. Hide the alloy." She didn't know who wrote it. Maybe Mick. Maybe someone else who knew what was coming. Either way, it confirmed what her gut already screamed. This wasn't about vintage aviation. It wasn't about restoration. It was about control. About silencing the past before it became the future again. She walked back into the hangar, locked the doors, and pulled down the metal shutter. Then she opened the false panel in the wall and placed the alloy back inside. Not because she was giving up, but because now she had something to protect. The offers started rolling in just 3 days after the men left. It began with a voicemail from someone claiming to represent a defense-adjacent museum in California, offering an undisclosed sum for preservation purposes. Then came a private email, no signature, no logo, promising 7 figures if she was willing to ship all materials, intact and unexamined, to a drop site outside Las Vegas. And then, just as she was preparing to shut it all down, An envelope slid under her shop door one morning. No return address. No sender. Just a cashier's check for $1.2 million made out to cash, and a single line typed beneath it. The past belongs to those who bury it best. Ellie burned the check in a metal coffee can behind the hanger. The temptation had been real. More money than she'd ever seen. Enough to fix her shop, clear her debt, start over in a place where no one knew what she'd found. But that wasn't the road she was on anymore. That changed the night she opened the second letter from Captain R. Green. It wasn't military. It was personal. Addressed to a daughter. One he hadn't seen since she was 6 years old. A daughter he left behind so he could fly just one more mission. Ellie read it 3 times, each slower than the last. If you ever wonder why I left, baby girl, it wasn't for glory. It was because some things are too important to ignore. They trusted me to carry something bigger than any one person. But I carried you with me, too, every mile. I hope one day you'll forgive me, and I hope someone will tell you what really happened. Because if this plane is ever found, that story deserves light, not a vault. Ellie felt like she was holding her own father's voice in her hands. He used to write notes like that smudged in grease, folded into lunchboxes, left in the corners of her workbench after school. Proud of you, kid. Don't forget your worth. He died of a stroke before he ever saw her take over the shop, before she could thank him for all the quiet ways he'd taught her to believe in herself. The lockbox wasn't just a vault of secrets. It was a bridge between men like Captain Green and daughters like her, between unfinished missions and the people left behind to make sense of them. She didn't want to sell that. She wanted to honor it. So she started making calls. Not to buyers, but to historians. To people who spent their lives archiving things no one else wanted to remember. She reached out to a veterans nonprofit that specialized in preserving Cold War records. She even called a local news anchor who once did a segment on her garage's World War II Jeep rebuild. The response surprised her. People wanted to help. Not for fame, for truth. Soon she had a plan not just to protect the plane, but to tell its story, to rebuild it piece by piece, and turn the hangar into more than just a garage. A living exhibit, a tribute, a monument to the crew who vanished, and the cargo they were never meant to carry. She wasn't chasing money anymore. She was chasing legacy. The restoration didn't start with tools. It started with silence. Ellie stood inside the plane one morning just after sunrise, sunlight bleeding through the rivet holes like stained glass. She didn't move for a long time. Just let the quiet wrap around her as if the aircraft itself was waiting for her to say something. She didn't. She just laid her palm against the inner wall and whispered, "We're going to do this right." From that moment on, the shop became a different place. Word had spread. Not about the classified material. She was careful not to let that part get out. But people knew Ellie was working on a plane with a story. A local vet, Staff Sergeant Daniels, dropped by with a box of surplus flight harnesses and refused to take a dime. "This bird reminds me of my old one," he said, rubbing the cold steel with weathered fingers. "Feels like coming home." A retired avionics engineer named Jules offered to rewire the cockpit panel just for the challenge. "I haven't touched a system this old in 30 years, she said, smiling. "But I think I remember the dance." Even kids started coming by. High schoolers with no shop class anymore. Girls who had never held a wrench. Boys who didn't know how to solder a wire. Ellie gave them gloves, handed them brushes, and taught them how to sand without scarring the metal. She watched something shift in them the way it had shifted in her, working on something real, something forgotten, brought back to life by their hands. She kept the restoration journal on her bench, a weathered binder labeled Project Firebird, a name pulled from Captain Green's letters. In it, she documented everything. The work, the progress, the setbacks. She taped photos to the pages, of the alloy, of the logbooks, of volunteers smiling beneath streaks of oil and sweat. It wasn't just about fixing a machine anymore. It was about making a record that couldn't be hidden again. The days were long, and some nights longer. The tail assembly took 2 months just to clean and assess. They found a damaged fuel bladder in one wing, a bird's nest so tightly packed into a hydraulic bay that it had fossilized into the metal. Parts were hard to come by. Some had to be fabricated from scratch. Ellie spent evenings drawing up CAD files based on the original specs, using scans from Green's lockbox. Each part rebuilt was a piece of someone's legacy being carried forward. And all the while, the plane started to change. Not just in form, but in spirit. The dull gray panels began to shine. The rust gave way to polished rivets. The empty cargo bay was slowly transformed into a museum space. One wall reserved for Green's letters, another for photos of Cold War aircraft crews lost to classified missions. The hidden panel was rebuilt, but left unsealed, a plaque beside it reading, "History waits quietly until someone listens." Ellie stood back one evening, the hangar doors wide open to let in the amber sunset. Her plane glowed like something alive, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was fixing something broken. She felt like she was giving something back. The day the plane was unveiled, it felt like the town held its breath. Ellie had parked it just outside the hangar, nose angled toward the early fall wind. The skin gleamed in soft silver and matte black, every panel buffed, every bolt tightened by hands that now carried calluses of purpose. A rope line circled the perimeter, and folding chairs filled with veterans, mechanics, teenagers in borrowed coveralls, and neighbors who still remembered Ellie's dad working out of that same garage years ago. At the center of it all stood the cargo plane, once rotting in a forgotten field, now standing proud like it never missed a beat. Ellie didn't want a big ceremony. She didn't write a speech. But when the local reporter nudged her gently toward the small podium, she didn't say no. She cleared her throat, one hand gripping the edge of the wood, the other holding a single folded letter, Captain Green's first. "I didn't fix a plane," she began quietly. "I listened to one." She told them about the day she first saw it, how it called to something inside her that she didn't even know was broken. She told them about the hidden box, the fragments of history sealed inside it, and the letters of a man who never got to finish his story. She didn't mention the alloy, didn't need to. This wasn't about classified materials or the value of what she found. It was about remembrance. This aircraft flew a mission that no one ever reported. It carried something that never made the news, never got filed in a museum, but someone once flew it with their whole heart. And someone else was meant to hear that story. I guess that someone was me. And now, maybe it's all of us. Silence followed. Then the kind of applause that wasn't loud, just deep, full, healing. Later, a woman in her 60s approached. Her voice trembled as she asked if the pilot's name was really Green. When Ellie nodded, she pulled a photo from her purse. A young man in uniform holding a toddler in a frilly dress. "He was my brother," she whispered. "They said he vanished. No one ever told us where." Ellie placed the restoration journal into her hands. "He left breadcrumbs," she said. "You deserve to see where they led." After the crowd cleared, Ellie walked the length of the plane slowly, her fingers trailing along its frame like she was saying goodbye. Only, she wasn't. She was releasing it. The same way you release grief. The same way you finally forgive yourself for not saving everything. Some things are meant to be found after the world has stopped looking. Back inside the hangar, Ellie opened the office door and looked around. Same cracked tiles. Same flickering overhead light. But the air was different now. It was charged like the past had been honored and made room for something new. The framed letter hung on the wall beside a photo of the finished plane, and just below it, the street. Christopher Metal Ellie had found tied to the yoke. She never learned who put it there. She didn't need to. That night, she sat in the cockpit alone. Not to fly, just to be. The wind rattled the metal skin gently, like a lullaby. Her hands rested on the yoke, not controlling, just holding. She thought about all the things that could have happened. The money she turned down, the risks, the threats, the nights she almost gave up. And yet here she was, not a millionaire, not a hero, just a mechanic who said yes to something that felt like a whisper in the bones of an old machine. She turned the key in the ignition. The lights flickered softly to life. The engines didn't start. They didn't have to. Because this wasn't about flight. It was about faith. Faith that what we restore can outlive us. That the stories buried in dust and metal can rise again. If someone, anyone is brave enough to listen. And somewhere in the middle of all that noise, Ellie Monroe had found herself not just in wrenches and rivets, but in the echo of a mission unfinished. And now, it finally was.